hand back to David to introduce the Minister. We're extremely pleased to have Sussan Ley with us, the Minister for Environment. I know that there's a whole range of issues here, not the least of which is the terrific recent announcement about additional resources for national parks, which we were very pleased to see. So, David, over to you. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Margie. And Sussan Ley, thank you very much for joining us this morning. Lovely to see you there. Look, we were just having a really interesting discussion with Simon Birmingham earlier about what's going on in the tourism sector. And yes, it is a devastating time. Hard to think of a worse time for most in the sector. But regional tourism has an opportunity here in many ways, given Australians don't have the opportunity to travel abroad. If this is going to be a more permanent increase in regional tourism, can I ask you as the Environment Minister what issues this raises for you when it comes to environmental management around a lot of, well, particularly sensitive sites in regional Australia?
Well, thanks, David, and we've had some assiduous sound checks, so hopefully everyone can hear me.
Yes, all good.
Good. Look, it does raise issues, but I think the opportunities are far more than the challenges we might face. It's interesting, I'm right here on the border between Albury and Wodonga, and my entire electorate office is taken over at the moment with all of the challenges of being in a border environment and how we help people actually go to work. But what I can report is that people are flooding into regional New South Wales and regional Queensland, if they get there in time, to take their holidays there. And in many cases, they're telling the small businesses they stop in along the way that they are going to a place they've never even, seen on a map, let alone visited. So I think that's a good news story for regional Australia. And I think that when people really appreciate there's fine food, there's fine wine, there's amazing vistas, there's fascinating stories, I agree, it's going to be a huge upside. Environmental management, well, I mean, that happens at the same time. It happens in our busy cities, it happens at the peri-urban area, it happens in our national parks. We in the state governments will continue to do that work. But visitation, as Simon Birmingham said, is just so critical.
Yeah, look, it is a terrific opportunity for many of those areas. We've also been talking a bit about infrastructure too, and getting projects big and small off the ground to help stimulate some economic activity and economic recovery. Can I ask you about the EPBC Act, the Environment Protection and Biodiversity Conservation Act? You've just received an interim report on this. What do you have in mind? What's your sort of aim here in the changes to this Act, particularly when it comes to what this could mean for big projects getting off the ground?
Well, it's been taking an average of 3.5 years to get the approval done on a significant project. That might be a resource project, but it might be a project that matters to tourism as well, and that's too long. So I've already got that timeline down to about 21 months, and we want to make it as efficient and effective as possible. And that's what Graham Samuel found in his interim report, that the Act that is supposed to protect the environment is not protecting the environment as well as it should, but it's not meeting the needs of proponents and the community. So, I don't divide people up between people who want to protect the environment, people who want developments, people who live here, people who live there. I mean, we're one country, we're one Australia, and at different times of our lives, we have different interests about the environment that we live in and things that we want to see happen and jobs that we want our children to have. And it's, it's one picture, not several. So when Graham talks about this, he says efficiency and effectiveness are not about coming at the expense of the environment, and any steps that we take will build on what we have now, and there will be the status quo or better when it comes to environmental protection. But for our visitors, our iconic 6 terrestrial national parks and all of our Indigenous protected areas like the Central Desert and places that are hard to get to, our marine parks are, only when you travel overseas do you realise how special these are. So, I see that strong environment protection as mattering to the economy, but in terms of tourism, mattering enormously.
Well, they do. You're absolutely right. I mean, this has been for many, many years the great selling point of Australia in an international tourism sense. You talk about Graham Samuel's report. I mean, he does say Australia's natural environment and iconic places are in an overall state of decline, and they're under increasing threat. The current environmental trajectory is unsustainable. That's a pretty damning report, isn't it, on where the direction things are headed in?
Well, he's certainly not mincing his words, and I like that. But then he goes on to make specific, manageable, doable recommendations that will actually bring about the differences that I think we all seek. And we're starting already with devolved approvals to state governments, and we know that West Australia was very interested in this from the perspective of getting jobs in the resources sector and seeing some recovery post-COVID. The interesting thing was that at the last National Cabinet meeting, the Prime Minister said to all the premiers, "Are you interested?" And they all said yes. So I've been on the phone to my Environment and Planning Minister counterparts in all of the states and territories, and they're all interested in taking on the role of both assessments and approvals. Monitored
so
by...
what does that mean for the Commonwealth, though? Sorry to butt in there, but what role does that leave the Commonwealth then when it comes to devolving those approvals?
We set the standards. They're Commonwealth-led. They're the status quo or better, and we provide the assurance role. So it's not set and forget. It's not hand over to the states and don't even worry about what they're doing. We do maintain that assurance role. So the standards, the new piece in this that hasn't ever come before the Parliament that I hope to introduce towards the end of August is about Commonwealth-led standards that give communities the assurance that the environment is being protected. So what we will actually do is accredit the states. We'll say your processes meet our needs, your processes meet our standards, and over to you. What we won't have is what we have now, where we have this sort of joint assessment. So a state government does an environmental impact study. We look at it on the way through, then it comes to us, we mark their homework. Sometimes we would say they don't do the thorough job that they should because they know it's coming to the Commonwealth, more timelines, more pinch points in the Act, more delays. So whatever the answer is going to be, I say, whatever the conditions of a development are going to be, because it often comes down to you've got to do it in a way that protects, enhances, or mitigates against the effects of threatened species. Let's get to that point sooner rather than later so people can get on and contribute and the environment can be protected.
So you are confident then, just to finish this point, that you can have faster approvals, a more efficient process, but a better environmental outcome than we've had?
Yes, I am, because what Graham Samuel's review says is that strong environmental protection is not there because the Act is failing. So everyone wants to see these outcomes, but the Act itself is not giving us what it, well, I'm not saying it ever did, but I'm sure it did, but the times have changed. You've got to remember it's barely been amended for 20 years. So everyone sees flaws in it, whichever side of the argument you might be on. You want to move on past this Act. And that's why, we are getting on with it and we are introducing early legislation on the way through. So Graham Samuel's review is very much about the complexity of the Act hampering the outcomes. So he's totally outcome focused. And that's actually the way to look at this, because everyone who works in environmental law is totally focused on process. But, let's step back and say, what's the outcome and how do we guarantee a good outcome?
Can I ask you about, you mentioned earlier some of our great environmental natural attractions, whether it's Great Barrier Reef, whether it's Uluru. Without the international tourism taking place, and until that does, what do you think can be done to encourage Australians, if they're able to cross interstate borders, to take the time, because it does take time, but spend the money as well, to see some of these places in their own backyard during this period?
Well, we're doing some things to help on the way through, and Margie Osmond knows them well. She's been a fierce advocate for many of them, and they include relieving park fees, helping inject some support into our tourism operators and so on. So I won't go into all the details of what those are, except to say that it's been very important and it's been well supported by our economic recovery packages, to keep our parks strong. And in fact, we've made the biggest single investment ever in our national parks of $233 million to actually upgrade some of the capital assets. So what it comes down to, David, is attracting, you've got to have good quality roads, visitor centre, accommodation options. I mean, we've got amazing tourism operators, so I don't think we can say that they need to improve. They're there waiting to showcase these attractions. That's what this capital injection is doing. It's helping build that. And then we've got to tell the story. And I think that COVID will help us tell the story in a roundabout way, silver linings and so on. And I always say to people, you've probably got Uluru-Kata National Park on your bucket list to go to, but why are you waiting till then? It's actually not that hard to go on your next holiday. So, we've got almost the biggest network of marine parks in Australia. Have you ever considered going to Christmas Island or Norfolk Island and actually looking at the marine environment from the perspective of those two external territories? It's not that hard to get to, and so on. So, I know that jointly with our tourism operators and this forum, we can tell that story.
Now, you mentioned earlier that you're right there on the border as the local member. Give us a sense of what the border closure or restrictions is meaning for your community in Albury-Wodonga. I mean, what is it like as a lived experience right now there?
It's absolutely awful. And my office here, and I'm in my electorate office, and I'm able to do some, thankfully, ministerial work virtually, but we are all, my team and I, dealing with people who are increasingly anxious, worried and desperate. Now, this is worse than a stage 4 lockdown for us because you cannot cross the border to go to your job if your job is outside that very thin blue bubble that is now being created by a New South Wales public health order. I'm not here to criticise the reasons for the public health order or the rationale. We all know what that is. But, I mean, I'm hearing from people who just had a young lady on the phone. She's just across the river at a place called Chiltern. It's just outside the bubble. She can see her job. It's in Albury. She can't get to it. She's not allowed to get a permit to go to work. There are all sorts of permits for all sorts of reasons, freight, medical, compassionate, and, a range of caring and education. And some people have to carry 6 or 7 in the car at once. And they've been told, sorry, you'll continue to have to carry 6 or 7. And every morning when you wake up, you'll have to reapply for another 6 or 7, depending on what you're doing. But, I come back to the Prime Minister saying at the beginning of this awful pandemic in Australia, every job that you can go to is an essential job. But here on the border, we are actually people are not able to go to work. So
just on that, I mean, would it make any sense? Obviously, life would be easier if the border did not lie in the middle of a residential area, and where people do have to go to school or work across the border from where they actually live. Would it make sense for the purposes of this crisis to enforce this border restriction a little further south, a little further north? I know this was talked about with Queensland and New South Wales as well around Tweed Heads, but I mean, is that something that would make more sense right now?
Well, look, conceptually, of course it would, but practically it wouldn't. We've got 34 border crossings and they're all policed effectively, and you can keep the queue as long as you like. And by the way, that's not the intent. But, you can actually stop people at that border. So if you were to do that, if you were to lock down Greater Melbourne, I was told you'd need to close 1,000 roads. Clearly, it's not possible. Yeah. So we are the front line by definition, not because we've done anything, so to speak, and not that anyone has. I mean, I'm not pointing the fingers of blame. But by definition, we are where you can effectively stop the traffic between the two states. And what I'm arguing for, well, not just me, but colleagues, is perhaps a work permit if there's a COVID-safe employer, and just introducing some sense of hope for people, because it's pretty awful. And then when the question is asked, how long do we have to live like this? The answer is, I don't know, maybe till Christmas. I mean, that's what I just heard from Victoria. So, we're resilient.
Very depressing, I know. It's very depressing to think about how long this might run. Look, final one from me. You're also a keen aviator, as we know. Have you been up in the plane lately? When was the last time? And what are your thoughts on regional aviation in particular right now, struggling through this crisis as well?
No, the answer is I haven't been up in the plane. Thankfully, I don't own a plane. Everyone who tells you that they own a plane will tell you how much it costs to keep it running.
I'm sure.
But I see a lot of people in the skies above us that are learning to fly from overseas. I think that's still happening up to a point, but it's a great regional driver of the economy to have training pilots in our airspace. And notwithstanding that pilots aren't working at the moment, when we get through this, there's still a massive international shortage of pilots. And I'd love to see regional Australia, in fact, Australia more broadly, be an international training destination of excellence, because we've got open skies, we've got plenty of room, and we've got great tourism assets to see on the way through.
Well, Sussan Ley, thank you very much for talking to us. I'll hand back to Margie now, who might have a few more questions for you. Margie.
Thank you very much, David. Good morning, Minister, and thank you again so much for joining us and putting up with the gorgeousness that is new technology. So thank you for that. Look, just one quick one, because I think David's been pretty comprehensive with this, but it is a question about Indigenous tourism, and I know that's near and dear to your heart, and we both had the pleasure of spending a little time in Kakadu. And I have a feeling that this is a great growth moment and opportunity for Indigenous tourism operators around the country, and that very close connection they have with the land, and in many instances that will be national parks. Do you see this as a big growth zone for people looking here at home for unique and wonderful experiences?
I do, and as you and I found when we went to Kakadu, Margie, when you talk to the visitors, they want to hear from the Indigenous rangers. They want to understand the more than 50,000 years of history and Indigenous connection to landscapes. They want to know so much more than just the beautiful landscape, the species, the crocodiles, of course, and all of that. And, you would know, people want to know so much more. So, 42% of Australia is owned or controlled by Indigenous Australians, and that might be our Indigenous protected areas, or it might be land under native title, or it might be close to your home. So there is just a huge curve of development, engagement, heritage, work that we can all be doing to, activate's a bit of a jargonistic word, but we don't realise that the stories that can be told. If I was to say not that far away from me, well, it actually is northern New South Wales, at the Brewarrina fish traps, you've got evidence when you stand in the river at low flow of how Indigenous Australians caught fish over 40,000 years ago, and you can actually see the way they moved the stones to catch the fish, and you can look at that. A lot of Australians will go, wow, I've never been to Brewarrina, where's that? And others would say, why don't we know about that? So that's just one small example, but they're everywhere. I was very proud when our Budge Bim National Park in Western District of Victoria, where the Indigenous traditional owners went to the World Heritage meeting and made their case for the listing of these similar but not quite the same eel traps in Budge Bim, and that was accepted, and it was a world first. So yes, lots to do in that space.
Wonderful. Well, it could not be in better hands. So thank you so much, and for your commitment to understanding how critical those parks are from the industry's perspective within tourism and elsewhere, as well as the critical environmental outcomes. So, Minister, thank you so much. And you may be pleased to know also that when we asked the question a little while ago whether or not people were in support of the government's current suppression strategy, 92% of people on the survey have come out and said, yes, we're supporting the government. So there we go. Thank you again, Minister, and thank you for joining us this morning.
Always a pleasure.
Thank you.